And thanks for making this interview possible, Warren. There are a couple of frames I kind of need to build before I talk to anyone about mind parasites. And probably the initial frame is about my approach to paranormal experience in general. I believe that paranormal experience is best investigated without arriving at formed conclusions. So it's interesting because we have people in the so-called skeptics movement, people like Michael Shermer, who I've had a confrontation with, and others. They tend to be, though there's no reason why skeptics have to have this stance, but they tend to be atheist materialist types, and not to be skeptics at all. They tend to be debunkers, people who believe in a negative, that certain things are not possible, that there is nothing happening in the unseen realm, that there is no ESP or of any sort, and so forth. And then they look for ways to defeat anybody who makes any claims or says anything about those subjects. And they do this usually by they usually research by proclamation. They don't use scientific methods to defeat the things that they claim to be skeptical about. Instead of investigating the unexplained, they explain away the uninvestigated, as one person put it. And also, they are the opposite of skeptics, because skeptics, even the word, came from Greek philosophers, the skeptics. And what they believed was that their powers of observation were increased by not arriving at conclusions. And in that sense, I consider myself a skeptic. I try not to arrive at premature conclusions, because once you have conclusions about a paranormal subject, then you are subject to what's called the confirmation bias, and you tend to corral evidence, and you tend to see all sorts of things confirming the conclusion you've already reached. But the problem with this is, there are a few problems with it. One is that the paranormal just contains a lot of ambiguity. Also, the paranormal has a kind of shape-shifting, multitudinous, and trickster aspect. So it's shape-shifting in that it can take on many different forms, and one false presumption that people will make is, if they're thinking about mind parasites, then they're imagining one type of parasites. But when we think about the parasites of the regular biological world, the macro and microbiological worlds, well, there isn't one type of parasite. There's a whole fantastic cryptozoology of many, many different types. And yet all those types are carbon-based. Once we, depart from the organic substrate, we should expect even more variety, even more multiplication of how fantastically varied things could be in another world that is more energy-based, since it doesn't have an organic substrate, so there doesn't need to be the regular sort of respiration and all this sort of thing that organically based organisms might need. And then there's the trickster aspect of the unconscious. It is constantly looking to trick us in various ways, to get us to think we've seen things that we haven't, to misinterpret what we've seen. And my friend George Hansen wrote a seminal book everyone should read, called The Trickster and the Paranormal. That's a whole subject in itself. And so basically, when you look at paranormal research, what I tend to find is that the people who say the most know the least. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at ufology, for example, where there's a lot of ambiguity and there's no consistent theory that explains all alien occurrences, unless the alien occurrences are of many different sorts. The people who know the least, they can tell you the names of everybody on the Palladian High Council. But the people who know the most and who are the best observers of the phenomenon, people like Jacques Vallée, are very careful not to reach fixed conclusions, because the material we have so far doesn't seem to support that. Now, maybe there are some Qigong masters somewhere who on a daily basis are removing energy parasites from people, and maybe their specificity of insight into the way they work is warranted for them. It's not for me. And so my personal stance toward mind parasites, as with other paranormal subjects, is that we're dealing with something that has certain, at least for me at this point, irreducible, ambiguous aspects, because they're not subject to imaging and MRIs and microscopes and things like that. It is very subjective. And so, therefore, everything that I say about this subject should be regarded as speculative. However, it would get very tiresome if I began every sentence with "it seems as if," or "according to sources," or "based on what people have experienced." So in the interview, I won't always put those disclaimers in front of every sentence, but the listener should just keep that frame in mind, that I regard what I'm saying, and they should regard what I'm saying as speculative. Let's consider parasites in the straight biological world, the parasites that we know exist. According to National Geographic, parasites outnumber all other species 4 or 5 to 1. In other words, there are 4 or 5 times more parasites than any other type of life form. Mm-hmm. And by an irony of fate of some sort, it turns out my dad, for the U.S. military during World War II, was a parasitologist. It was kind of dangerous at the time because they used live culture slides. They're mostly like doing stuff with like syphilis and like STDs and things that servicemen were picking up abroad. And so there's a high risk of infection. And so that was his danger in World War II until D-Day, when they pulled him out of the lab and put him, in a totally hellish battle experience. But so parasites are very real, and there are 3 classic relationships of energetic transaction that I'm aware of in the natural world. And one is parasitism, and it's so common that most parasites themselves have parasites, that almost all organisms have parasites, and sometimes even the parasites inside other parasites have parasites. So malaria, for example, what is that? It's a microbial parasite that lives in another parasite, mosquitoes. Mm-hmm. The other 2 classic relationships of energetic transaction are symbiosis and, of course, predation. And human beings are variously all 3. Technically, I think we're considered predators at this point, but we are also, some people would consider us parasites, feeding off the life energy of the planet and not taking particularly good care of the host. And of course, we also can be symbionts at times, like, working cooperatively with others and so forth, and other species, sometimes at least. So it's also possible for us to miss an entire domain of life. And the example of this that should be most obvious is that up until a Dutch janitor or shopkeeper, I've heard him described as either A.V. Leeuwenhoek in the 1700s, ground the first lenses that were good enough to be able to resolve an amoeba through a primitive microscope. And amoeba, I guess, is a giant of the microbial world. Mm-hmm. No culture, Western, Eastern, tribal, whatever, had any clue about the microbiological world. Surgeons were washing their hands after surgery, but not before. So we all miss this. Now imagine how fantastic it would sound if I were to tell somebody of a man of 1700, even a Renaissance man with the best European education, that do you realize that there are zillions of animals and plants all around you that you're not seeing? That, in the carpet that you might be sitting on right now, there are dust mites, these, if I showed him a picture of what they look like, these monsters crawling around that you can't see. Mm-hmm. And that not only, there isn't just one type of animal out there, but there's a zillion different species, and they also will, of course, be parasites, some of them, because the same relationships of energetic transaction will apply to this microbiological plane as applied to the macrobiological plane. And that not only that, even more mind-blowing, that your body is actually made of like 60 trillion of these little animals you can't see. So they're not just out there, they are you. And they are comprising you. So what every culture except one has identified, even though they missed the microbiological plane, is an energetic plane of organisms. You can call them spiritual organisms or whatever, and they are referred to by many different names in many different cultures. The only culture that doesn't recognize them is scientific materialism, fundamentalist materialism, because we don't presently have instruments to identify them. But maybe one day we will. Maybe just the microscope, that will be able to see, metaphorical microscope, but the imaging device that will be able to see such things, maybe it just hasn't been invented yet, but maybe one day it will be. But meanwhile, every culture has recognized them and recognized their effects, other than scientific materialism. And every culture has also recognized that some of these organisms are parasitic. And so the Christians called them incubi and succubi. And the study of disincarnate spirits and their effect on human health was a mainstream branch of the medicine of both India and China that is still in use to this day and very effective. We know that acupuncture is very effective, and Western science even acknowledges that. And in Chinese medicine, of these, like, I forget how many meridians or energy points that would be used in acupuncture, there are some like, say, 38, and the exact numbers and stuff are in my essay or podcast on my website called Mind Parasites, Energy Parasites, and Vampires. People can find that at my website, zaporacle.com. And so let's say it was 38 of those points have the prefix que in front of them, and que means disincarnate entity. So these are points that are identified in the body where disincarnate spirits may feed. And in Ayurveda, the traditional medicine of India, the effect of disincarnate spirits on health is just a medical subspecialty on par with gynecology or any other mainstream medical specialty as far as it's concerned. Mm-hmm. So a culture is in trouble whenever it denies a vast area of human testimony, like we once did that about child abuse. So here's a vast area of human testimony that every culture affirms this other domain of life, and that it contains symbionts, parasites, and predators, except us. And I think that's a problem, and I think we need to at least acknowledge that all this testimony exists and must mean something. Now, we don't have to go along with the way various cultures or people interpret what they are reporting in their own testimony, but we shouldn't just ignore it as or reduce it in the way of reductive thinking, where something complex is reduced to what Jung referred to as a nothing but. Oh, well, that's nothing but the addled product of paranoid imaginations or something like that. There's just too much of it for us to do that.